Okay, here we are in Matthew chapter 14, and Matthew records an amazing miracle here in verse 13. When Jesus heard what had happened, you have to go back and remember, we talked about how John the Baptist was murdered by beheading due to Herod's, what I think is just pure pride. And anyway, you heard me last time. Anyway, hearing of this, well, wait a second. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. It's taken me a while to get my hands around or my mind around the idea that Jesus was an emotional person, just like every healthy person is. We don't all express our emotions in the same way or with the same intensity, but we all have them. And one of the strongest emotions that I've ever felt is grief. Jesus, although Matthew doesn't say, because of his grief, he pulled away, but we come short of saying that when Jesus got the news, he headed out to a solitary place. I tend to not, in terms of the grief that I've experienced, I'm not great at talking about it, especially at first. Now, a little bit later, it's good for me to talk about it. And if you're experiencing grief in your life right now, I so highly recommend that you find a church that has a grief share ministry. They can help you navigate the difficult and non-sequential grief experience, an experience that you think you're done with, and then bingo, you realize you're not. It's a confusing, frustrating process and experience of life. Find a church that does grief share and get connected to that. Jesus, though, pulls away to a solitary place. I needed that when my mom and my dad, and my sister and my best friend died. I needed to be kind of where I was solitary. I didn't spend a lot of time there, as we're going to see Jesus, although I'm not even sure I can say he wanted to. He wasn't able to spend a lot of time in solitude either. I guess what I got a little sidetracked on is the idea that Jesus was a person with emotions. And the reason he was a person with emotions is because he became human. The next sentence in that same verse 13, hearing of this, that he had left, right? The crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. I look at that and think, okay, I don't know how long the boat ride was, but that's all the solitude that he got. There are going to be times when you're not going to get the solitude that you're maybe seeking, especially if you're an introvert. Extroverts are not very enthusiastic about solitude. They don't really need that as much. They need this people contact. I don't know whether Jesus was an extrovert or an introvert. I'm pretty sure he was an ambivert, meaning he was both on, and this depended on what his life situation was. I was going to say, well, I think he was hoping for time. Here's the thing, because Jesus was human, yeah, he had limitations. But because he was God, I don't think there was anything that happened to him that he didn't somehow have foreknowledge of. Well, the people heard he was headed out by boat. So they run around the Sea of Galilee on foot. And when the boat docks, there they are, a large crowd. Now, if Jesus had been an introvert, he would have said to disciples, get rid of them, I gotta be alone. I gotta have some me time. Jesus did have me time. I mean, he broke away early, very early in the morning, Mark says, to be alone and to pray. Sometimes he prayed all through the night. But here he doesn't, he's not after me time now. He sees the people and he had compassion on them. There are a lot of times when I have, and this is true in my past and in my present as well, for different reasons. When I've been under a lot of stress, when I've had a lot of demands made on me, when I've been called on to do lots of challenging things, and then on top of that, I get bad news about a person who's very dear to me. It's hard for me to express compassion. There are people, I'm sure, that their own sadness makes them more open to the situation of others, and for compassion to be the outcome of that. Jesus, I think, was kind of in that spot where, I mean, look at his life. He and his disciples didn't even have time to have a meal together. Wherever he went, there were crowds of people, always somebody symbolically tugging on his cloak or touching him or begging him for healing. And then he hears of John the Baptist being beheaded. Well, he still had compassion on it. Something I got to work on. Verse 15, as evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. And Jesus replied, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. One of the great gifts that God has given to Debbie and I, he's given us tons of fabulous gifts, and many of them are traveling and trips that we never dreamed we'd be able to have. One of them was our friend James, the director of our library in the Middle East, took us to the Holy Land, and we got to walk on and be at the hill that biblical historians have identified as the place where the feeding of the 5,000 occurred. And even today, it's kind of in the middle of nowhere. And the disciples said, man, you need to send them away because they got to go get something to eat. All right, that's a legitimate, reasonable thing to think about and talk about. But they didn't get the answer they were after. Jesus said, hey, don't send them away. You guys feed them. Verse 17. We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Now, I'm going to find out at the end of this little narrative, there are 500 men and their families there. I don't know that that means there were 15,000, but I know it means, it's hard for me to imagine that there weren't 10,000 there. Okay. Jesus says, okay, bring them here to me. In verse 19, and he directed people to sit down on the grass, taking the loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Now, I think I can tell you what prayer Jesus uttered before he broke the bread. It was a standard mealtime prayer of the Jew. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, who gives us the grain for this bread. Okay, I think that's what he would have said. No big deal, but if you ever get on Jeopardy, maybe that might pull it off for you. But anyway, he gave thanks and he broke the loaves. It was probably not loaves in the Western tradition, loaves that you would slice up. This was probably flat bread, pita bread. And sometimes, if you think about a piece of pita bread being carried around till the end of the day, you didn't cut it, you broke it. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Now, there's a little thing in here, and it sparks my imagination. It's that Jesus gave the disciples these pieces of bread that he had broken, and the disciples and the pieces of meat, of fish, and the disciples gave them to the people. Now, how in the world did that work? Did Jesus keep breaking and keep breaking and keep breaking and keep breaking? There's another piece of this to wonder about. Were these just the 12 apostles, or could it have been the wider circle of disciples? I want to believe it's a wider circle of disciples, and the reason I want to believe that is because it would have taken many hands to carry those broken pieces of bread to a crowd. Let's be ultra conservative and say 6,500 people. It would have taken a long time if there hadn't been many hands. And I wonder even, was it possible that as the disciples distributed this bread, there was always more in their hand or basket to be passed out? I don't know. All I know is this was not this can't be explained away as, well, it was, that was absolutely a miracle. And if you or I had been there as one of the 6,500 to 10,000 people, imagine being a kid there. Wouldn't you have a story to tell? I remember that day. You're not going to believe this. All right, here's the last thing I want to say about it. I've never experienced that kind of a dramatic, impressive, cataclysmic kind of miracle. I doubt if you ever have. This is not a promise that we will. It is an example of two things: the compassion of Jesus and his power and his work. I love that our Savior didn't just say, he could have said what he said to Satan, the first temptation. Man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word of the Lord. He didn't. Could have said, well, sit back down. I've got more to tell you, and this is more important than bread for your belly. No. He understood. He understood the need. Wow. Well, overtime again. I got to quit that. I'll see you next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.